These are really good. Okay. These bulldog spicy ramen. Now the salt is awful, but it is so spicy and hot. It is great. They were on sale. Second, if the snowstorm is coming your way, Mr. Jockin, good luck. We've insulated everything. We're hoping to survive. There's no guarantees. We will see. So ought to be fun. Christian, I don't think you have an ultra snowstorm on. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. He has ramen. Christian knows. Well done, sir. So I hope the ultra snowstorm does not kill us. And Dimitri, I'll throw it to you, sir. I think I just froze for a minute. The snow's already here. Oh man. Let me try. Oh, good times. Good times. Did it freeze? Am I back? No, I'm back. Okay. Yeah, I'm sorry. You see, the other thing that happened is I came outside because it was like 50 degrees and really nice. And I'll throw it to you, Dimitri, on anything. I'm interested on what is pluralism and is it possible? Because I'm to like, what exactly is it? Which I like. But I came out here and it was 50 and wonderful, and it's dropped to like 30 in 5 seconds. But Dimitri, how are you, sir? You doing okay? And yes to ramen, Christian. How you doing, Dimitri?
Yeah, I'm doing good. Actually, I after the exams I have like 1 month of freedom from the university. So I just published a new song and I wrote an article and I wrote another article on the Slovenian school reading group, which we're gonna recommence for this year. So last year we did two books. We did by Mladen, Voice and Nothing More, and then by Alenka Zupancic, The Odd One In. And so now, of course, there's one more left in the Slovenian school who we haven't read, and that's Slavoj Žižek, the man, the myth, the legend himself. And so, I mean, this man, he's written so many books, right? But we chose to go with the parallax view. Why? Well, Voicing Nothing More and The Odd One In were published around 2006. And the Parallax View was also published in 2006. And back then, Zizek said that this is his opus magnum. And so I think right now he would say it's less than nothing, but at least it's a very formidable, very serious, very dense work. It's not even that long. I think it's like 400 pages or like 370. So it's not that extremely long, like less than nothing. But yeah, the concept of the parallax view, that's what it's about. And for Zizek, this is the concept he uses to rehabilitate uh, dialectical materialism. And so if there's yeah, one term you want to say, what is the philosophy of Zizek? Well, it's dialectical materialism. Of course, Christian atheism is a part of that, like war communism or like conservative communism is a part of that too. But the very basis, the metaphysical basis, is dialectical materialism. And so he juxtaposes dialectical materialism to mechanical materialism, as well as obscurantist idealism. And yeah, so in this article that I just wrote, it's a very short article. I just wanted to see, okay, why stick with this term? Like, why dialectics and then why materialism? Like, what does it really mean? And so, the dialectical part, let's start there. The dialectical part for Zizek means that that in the basis things are metaphysically a self-repelling one. So he's not a monist, he's also not a dualist. You could call him a non-monist. This would perhaps be a more fitting term. I know people have used that. But so the basis of the cornerstone of dialectical thinking is the self-repelling one, which is also interesting for thinking pluralism, by the way. And I think Zizek would have a lot to bring to that and dialectical materialism. And so now let's move to the second one, materialism, which is very strange. Very strange indeed. Okay, so Hegel said that all philosophy is idealism. Let's start right there. And Zizek, of course, is I guess the most famous Hegelian philosopher today, right? So what's happening there? Immediately, things seem to be very incommensurable and maybe needlessly confusing. But he has very good reasons for calling it materialism. So you can go back to the ancient Greeks to see what's materialism about, but let's just stay within the 19th century right now. So the term materialism really became more popular with Feuerbach's critique of Hegel. So instead of doing, let's say, an idealist type of theology on the essence of God and like science of logic, or like philosophy of right, or phenomenology of spirit. For Feuerbach, God was a mere projection of man and therefore was only of anthropological interest. So it was really about the material. There's something in man that is material that makes him become an idealist. And so actually, let's go back to the ancient Greeks because there is something I have noticed which I found so fascinating. And that is that if you look at Aristotle's four types of causes, we start always with the material cause, and then at the end we always go to the final cause, right? So the final cause is about teleology, the ultimate telos or purpose of a thing, the ultimate goal, which is metaphysically beauty. And so it seems to me that there's a type of hierarchy here of causality, right? Like material cause inheres in formal cause, inheres in efficient cause, inheres in the ultimate purpose, the final cause. And so in this sense, matter is actually quite a low thing, right? And also if we take a look at Plato, matter is not really conceived of as, if in the general Neoplatonist reading, you would basically want to get rid of matter. Like you want to, matter is not really a sufficient way to explain the causality of things. And so with modern science, well, with Descartes, we got this shift towards the efficient cause, but it seems that there have been even more denigrations of idealism that we have now ended up at materialism and matter as a thing to be taken seriously. And so there's a very strange agreement here that I'm fascinated about, and my dream is to write a book about it one day. But it's the disagreements and agreements of Zizek and Chomsky. Because for Chomsky is a Cartesian, reading Descartes through the second cognitive revolution in the 50s in the States. But for Chomsky is definitely materialist. But Chomsky also is very adamant about the fact that we don't have a concept of the physical. And then you start reading Zizek, and he says that his materialism is a materialism without matter. And I think that they completely align here. And so both Chomsky and Zizek, being, very well read in science, agree on something fundamental that has happened, that like basically the relationship between the ghost and the machine. Chomsky says, no, it's not that we've exorcised the ghost, we've exorcised the machine. And all that's left is the ghost, or as Hegel would call it, spirit, right? So there's a strange conversation emerging here that Zizek wants to intervene with by saying, no, I'm a dialectical materialist. Okay, so a materialism without matter. How does this start? So, because if we want to be dialecticians, there's a self-repelling one. There is no matter that is ultimately identical to itself. All the matter that we supposedly perceive or sense or logically think in an abstract manner, these are actually all self-repelling ones and have a certain type of minimal difference to them, which are not self-same in an abstract manner. So then still the question emerges, but then why stay with the term materialism? Why not just call it idealism? And it's quite subtle what Zizek actually does, but he does say, why not idealism? And so for Zizek, if we would stay with dialectical idealism, it would just be the self-repelling one, and we wouldn't have to, let's say, explicate that working assumption. So we could say about everything, okay, that's a self-repelling one, that's a self-repelling one, that's gonna fail, that's lacking, that's lacking, that's lacking. Everything is lacking, everything in its basis is a self-repelling one. So why think anything anyway? Like, why does it matter? Like, why not just sit there and be like, okay, well, everything can be just denigrated into annihilation. But that's actually where materialism comes in. So for Zizek, the matter of the subject is fantasy. That is basically the only, and in fantasy is what? It's also the only object that the subject uh, relates to in a very weird way because it's the object cause of desire. So Zizek would say things like, it's not that we desire fantasy, but actually, first there's fantasy, and fantasy tells us how to desire. Because in the basis, we do not know what we want. That's what it means to be a hysterical subject, which for Zizek is ontological. And so matter here is really the real of unconscious fantasy, and the fact that there is no way in which the self-repelling one can itself function as a coherent, uh, neutral background. Like the subject is necessarily implicated in its own matter. So we have to think the libidinal economy of the subject, and this is actually the materialism of it. And well, yeah, this is a real book that Zizek wrote. It's a real book. It's not a book that you read and then you're like, okay, that was a nice book. Like this is a hard and tough book. And basically, he uses the parallax gap, which is another thing very interesting. I'll just explain very shortly. So if we think about left-wing politics versus right-wing politics, whatever way that we start conceiving this always is from a left-wing or a right-wing perspective. So, for example, you can say, well, what if I'm a centrist and I say that left wing is X and right wing is Y? Well, then a leftist will come along and say, well, you're a right winger, or a right wing will come along and say, well, you're a left winger, right? And this is basically how the parallax, so the shift of perspectives, comes about. And the ultimate point of the book is not just to develop the parallax gap as a concept, as a central concept of dialectical materialism, but then to make them operative, to make this concept operative in three domains. So one is philosophy, which he takes to be, yeah, in about the ontological difference, or the let's say the capital D difference that precedes all differences, which is an agreement that Lacan and Deleuze had, that there was such a thing, which is also singular, by the way, which is not uh, like plurality or multiplicity stems from the singularity of negativity, or from this, let's say, capital D difference. Then the second domain Zizek goes into in the book is science, and specifically cognitivism. Now, that's also an egotistical reason that I wanted to read this book specifically, because I'm studying linguistics, which is a cognitivist science. And he doesn't like denounce it, but the way that he makes dialectical materialism operative is that he really wants to run with the logic of cognitivism to see what it gets stuck on, to see what are the paradoxes that it cannot resolve within its own internal coherence. Okay, and specifically in cognitivism, the goal of the cognitivist scientist is to provide an account, like a third person neurobiological account of our first person experience, which are, of course, they're always going to be split. They're never going to meet, but still, this is the pursuit in cognitivism. And so third, so philosophy, science, and the third is politics. And here the self-repelling one means that no, there's no, let's say, yeah, social antagonism, no political battle, or no war in which there's a common ground between conflicting agents. Yeah, I mean, whatever war you start reading things about, there always is at least a tint of propaganda, or just that. Just to take the Ukraine, I've been actually, reading and seeing a lot about the Ukraine war, and there's just so much Russian propaganda as well as Ukrainian propaganda, propaganda from all sides, right? So these are the three domains that Zizek wants to think. And yeah, we're gonna take 1 year with this book, which I think is the appropriate time. Usually in academia, you take 1 week with a book, or with maybe just one sentence on like a foundational thinker, and then just say, ah, well, he's very old anyway. We do things differently now. And yeah, so no, that's not how we do it at Philosophy Portal. And yeah, you're all welcome to join. So.
First off, you are a very gifted expositor. The way you ran through that was very engaging and enjoyable and very well spoken, sir. And your ability to really go into the nuance of Zizek's thinking, like to ask that question, why not dialectical idealism? Like that was the perfect question to bring up, like as you're speaking. And just really wonderful. I really enjoyed that, Dimitri. And I do think it has like I said, I've been thinking about pluralism and what exactly that is. And, some people hear the word pluralism and they think you're talking about open borders. No, we're not talking open borders. They hear pluralism, they think you're saying anything goes. No, when I talk about pluralism, and I'll say a few things on what you shared, which I really enjoyed and give it to Christian here, is I always have in mind basically, I believe it's Berger and Hunter, and the way they talk about it is say pluralism, like the world has always known. So, for example, the Christian has always known there was a Hindu, that the Hindu existed, right? That's one thing. But it's another thing when your neighbor's a Hindu. That's pluralism, when your neighbor's a Hindu, and you're interacting them in the everyday, right? Because there's one sense in which pluralism has always been with us, right? I mean, we've always had difference. What are we exactly talking about, right? Well, it is about a sociological condition in which everydayness is regularly met with an encounter of difference that you have to respond to. That's the other kind of dimension of pluralism. It's not merely the abstract knowledge of the other. There is some sort of sense of regular response to the other, and they don't share your worldview or your givens or things like that, right? And the reason, and of course, the problem with that is, of course, if you say anything goes, you get a kind of flattening, horizontal, where everyone becomes, typically they become fungible to interact. But then if you don't have any sort of, dare I say, transcendent, there's no authority to bring people together, there's nothing to bind them together, and you get all sorts of problems, right? And what's very interesting with what you're describing about, like if we just talk about the lack or the dialectical materialism, all of these with the parallax view are suggesting a kind of mode or a way of approaching, I just want to say reality, we could say politics, science, philosophy, that actually allows difference, but it is also, there's a certain authority to it. There's a certain like reality that you're actually trying to approach. And when you talk about the repelling one, I like that as well, because as you were speaking, and so there's a few things actually that come to mind. I always find it funny, and it makes me think of what Christian has talked about. Like if you ask scientists what is matter, we don't know. We actually don't know what matter is. It's really funny because if you come down to one thing, you get into trouble, and Christian has talked about that. And as long as you don't ask what is matter, we're good to go, right? And it all works. But if you ask what is matter, we get into some issues. And what's interesting too with
Like, and
that,
also never ask a linguist what a word is. Don't do it. Don't let them define it. They
but
won't.
isn't it funny
They don't
that
want
when
to.
you get like, and it makes me think of, we've talked about isn't it funny? Like if you get to a fundamental concept, you can't talk about it. Like the moment you get to every field does it. Tell me what God is. I'm that. Tell me what matter is. Tell me what a word is. Tell me what love. Like when you get to something fundamental, there's a failure of language, right? And the question becomes, can that very failure be a ground of pluralism that doesn't dissolve into chaos, right? That's one kind of question. Second, I really like how you were describing, and you really put it very well. Well, what I was going to say is there's something really funny where you get rid of, say, the final cause in order to be able to define what matter is, and now you can't. Like, it's interesting how that hierarchy you described is actually necessary for the identification of all the things, right? So there's a kind of hierarchy, but that it's actually an identification of an ordering that makes understanding possible, right? And that's really weird because a lot of times let's remove the other causes to just focus on, say, the efficient or the material or whatever. You think that's going to give you clarity, but it doesn't. All it does is actually make you have some fundamental that you can't address. And ultimately, that's why simplistic materialism, I guess, ends up basically just under an efficient utilitarianism. It almost always does because you
Yeah, that's the
can't.
mechanical
Yeah,
materialism.
it
Yeah.
always ends up into the mechanical materialism because you can't say people matter is all there is. Okay. And yeah, you have to jump back to the mechanical materialism. You can't literally stay on a literal materialism because we don't friggin' know what matter is and we don't know what it would mean, right? Like you have to carry it out. And what I'm also thinking about, because I always love to bring in Dante here, is that when you're talking about the stress on materialism as the fantasy, as a kind of the way that we actually. Well, this is why in the classical mind, eros is everything. Like matter, in like reality and eros are inseparable, right? And for someone like Dante, the very eros of materiality is a pulling one into the Beatrice, a pulling one into the definitive in the relationship, right? And it's interesting to think, because I'm always, as you know, thinking like the repelling one versus the inviting. Like you're invited into a repelling. It's Beatrice, I won't smile, but I'll draw you closer to a place where I can smile more without overwhelming, right? There's this sort of repelling that also makes possible actually, like, because if there wasn't any repelling, there couldn't be eros. It would just be given, right? Like the repelling actually kind of creates romantic possibility because there's a denial of desire, of which creates desire and calls desire to dare I say, a higher quality. So there's a repelling that also has an invitation. But then that would require you to come to terms with your desire. And how do you do that? So I really like, I'll throw it to Christian here. All my sticky notes are now blowing away because I guess the storm's here. I don't know. There was more to say, but I just really appreciated what you were sharing. But let me throw it to Christian and Mr. Jockin. And Christian, thank you for being here, sir.
And thank you for being with me. I don't know if anyone will get that reference, but I just asked a linguist what the word means. And yesterday, it was very fun. And I think she ended up getting a bit frustrated. And I was like kind of trying to explain like why the definition wasn't working and the problems with like circular reference and all this stuff. We were having a good spirited, good faith debate about deep metaphysics. But it was, it helped me realize how important like someone's basic strengths in terms of logical consistency and systemic coherence are when we start to try to talk about deep metaphysical systems. Because a lot of people, I think, and this isn't it's not a pejorative statement, but a lot of people have a really good grasp at like just being able to like link concepts together and good recall and have a decent ability to know where an answer needs to go. But then when they shove something in that blank spot, well, I'll critique Whitehead. I feel like a lot of philosophy, especially Whitehead, who I'm going to be unapologetically critical of, it's metaphysical Mad Libs. It's just like, here's my beef with Whitehead in the core. He's so passionate about trying to get rid of the mind-body explanatory gap. And then what does he do? He comes back to actual occasions which have a mental and physical polarity. Does he ever explain what polarity means? No. So you just have this enigmatic polarity that is nothing. It's just a word. If you try to explain it, you're going to find yourself in problems really quickly. So he just reintroduces the same gap. But I feel like his system is so complex and there's so much novel language that it's really easy to think that there's some meaning there, that if you just understand it better, it'll finally reveal itself. And I'm very skeptical. And he also, I think he's like a good philosophical litigator, because I think he got his butt handed to him with Principia Mathematica and realized, how easy it is to totally just dismantle a whole system with a really simple critique from Gödel. And so he hedges all of process philosophy as speculative philosophy and says, well, it can be updated. It's not complete, blah, blah, blah. It's like, all right, well, you can say that about literally anything. And then you can put a stamp and label it and then say, well, it's just evolving. It's still, but anyway, all right, I got that off my chest. Sorry, Whitehead. But I've been, when I was talking with this gal the other day, yesterday, last few days, I came back again to the question of ultimate questions. She actually pointed me to a fun, really short story from Isaac Asimov, The Final Question, which is a little sci-fi parable about what ultimate reality, and it invokes this idea of like all consciousnesses melding into one super consciousness, and then a cyclical collapse and reemergence of life, let there be light, etc. Which I think my friend was taking a bit literally and instead of as a parable. But But yeah, I think when it comes to pluralism, there's a lot of, I think, good work to be done in really deeply deconstructing and doing away with monisms, because that's going to just continue to lead to problems again and again and again. I mean, it's what William James called a clash of temperaments, but I'll just say like a clash of starting points, right? If you're just starting from different metaphysical basis, well, you can have fun debating all day, but you're just going to be running around in circles and things will never get off the ground for the moment. I mean, that's not 100% true all the time. Like you can maybe persuade someone, but that persuasion requires, I mean, to shift your basic metaphysics, I think it's going to require one of two things. Either you have to, if you're purely into like the abstract structures of the thought, that means you might have to sacrifice everything you've built on top of that foundation and start again. And that's just energy consumption, right? And we don't want to have to use more energy for stuff, right? That's hard. So fuck that. Or you have some type of emotional commitment to that metaphysical position, and there's some intrinsic fear, like, it's maybe to do with your spiritual community or your commitments to philosophers who you've given some authority, whatever it might be, or some type of belief that comes from, fear of death, afterlife, whatever it might be. So like I think I'm doing work, and I want to keep doing work that I see in William James, which is like the psychology of philosophy. The questions of not just what do we believe, but why do we believe that? What guides our intuitions? One concept I'm working on, which I lightly introduced in the paper I sent you, Daniel, is what I'm now calling qualia salience. And I was just doing a lot of interesting research about contemporary science research about things like, what's it called, sensory perception sensitivity and interoceptive sensibility, and basically there's like great evidence about how people's sensory experiences can be more or less salient in their awareness, as opposed to maybe the action of thinking or something like this. And also meditators report seeing more vivid colors, etc. But my thesis, which two papers were published last year, which both support the thesis, which is fun, is that people's qualia salience correlates to their metaphysical intuitions. So people with higher sensory sensitivity also are more likely to have a sense of an inner or spiritual self, which is really interesting. And this vibes with my theory that someone like Daniel Dennett, who said, I have an intuition that consciousness isn't real, but I don't give it credit. And then you have other people who say the only thing that's obviously real is consciousness. This stark contrast, I am going to, speculatively pin down to, at least in part, qualia salience. And I think a cool metaphor is just to think about it like nearsightedness. So it's kind of like a Platonic metaphor I have. Like, imagine a world where everything you need to do exists like a foot in front of your face. So we live in a world where you don't need to be able to see more than a foot. But some people can't see more than a foot, while other people can. And so once in a while, let's go out of this kind of new cave, Platonic cave, so to speak, and look off into the distance and say, wow, there's stuff over there. And the nearsighted people, they're like, I don't know, man. There's kind of just this vague blur. I kind of have, but I don't know. I think actually you guys are hallucinating. And then you have to develop illusionism and this kind of evolutionary neurobiological theory of why other people seem so convinced that consciousness is real. And so the qualia salience theory is just basically the reverse. Why is it that some people are so skeptical that consciousness is real? And I'm going to put it down to the low qualia salience. You have a low qualia salience, you are, as these studies said, are less likely to have a sense of inner self. That's a core, what I call crypto-essential qualia, the sense of a subjective observer, etc. So that's something fun I'm working on. And I think the reason I find it like possibly a pragmatic theory, is because it gives people a basis on which to then like engage in meditation practices which increase your quality of salience. And then we have a basis for perhaps bridging some of these core metaphysical differences that we arrive at, these kind of basic intuitions. It's like, oh, and if nothing else, we at least have a theory of why. Even if we're committed to our positions, we can point to something that they have in common, which is like a measurable psychological, neurobiological thing. So that's interesting. I have a question that has been alive for me. I'm just going to throw it out there. I don't mind if no one wants to pick it up, but so I'm working on basically the essay I sent you, Daniel, into a book. It's going to be called, I think, Reality Flush. I'm really excited about that title. But it's an attempt to create something of like a perennial metaphysics. I mean, it's an exploration of how triadic metaphysics shows up in like so many philosophies, so many spiritual traditions, from Plato to Lao Tzu to Buddha. Like, it's just everywhere. And, you know, without needing to dress that up in a certain, extra spiritual belief system, maybe that alone, it can create a little bit of a bridge for people to at least communicate with each other coming from different traditions and cultures and whatnot. Just a very basic common triadic grammar, I think, might be helpful. But, this raises a question for me, and it's something I think it's like really common in like liminal web, sense-making web, adjacent spaces, which is like this kind of villainization of the Cartesian split, right? Where this is supposed to, I just listened to David Bentley Hart say that, this is responsible for capitalism. And I am skeptical. There might be a really good argument to make for that, but I'm skeptical of it. And I kind of think that us who engage in philosophy tend to like project the importance of philosophical theory onto the rest of reality, maybe more than is due. Because then it seems like a more meaningful thing to engage in. But I don't know. Like, to me, I feel like capitalism and conflict can be, understood in so many ways that really have nothing to do with people's metaphysical positions, which for the most part, I think people don't even have, right? Like, the average person I talk to doesn't have a metaphysical position outside of maybe something like I believe in God or whatever, right? Something more narrative based anyways. So like, first of all, is there a good argument? And if anyone knows any like literature on this, I'd be happy to read it and look at it. But is there any good argument for why the Cartesian split has led to capitalism, materialism? Well, I know how it leads to materialism as a philosophy, but I mean like cultural materialism, meaning crisis type problems. Again, like, I think the vast majority of people who are suicidal are not having a philosophical existential crisis about whether it's all mind or it's all matter. I think it's more to do with relationships and all that kind of thing. So the Cartesian split is the mind-body split. So Descartes, like the difference between my phenomenological conscious experience, mind, and then the matter, life, reality, material world, etc. So I think, for me, the triadic formulation is the one that really rings the bell. So I'm going to keep pursuing that. But to me, it's, I have no discomfort whatsoever with the gaps between the domains that form triadic formulations or dualistic formulations. It's interesting to me that people find it so uncomfortable. I like Roger Penrose a lot because I just like his embodied personality. He's very comfortable with uncertainty. He's very quick to say when he doesn't know something. But in his book, he just posits the three mysteries between the three Platonic domains. So yeah, we don't know how the physical world relates to the world of mind, how the mental world relates to the world of ideals, and so on. Those are just the three mysteries. And to me, it's like if we want to take a mysterious position that rejects some type of monistic or final claim on reality itself, then we can't ever fill those gaps. And why is that a problem though? If we know enough about them to like be able to translate between gaps, like I know what greenness means in a material sense, I know what it means in a phenomenological sense, and I know what it means in an ideal, abstract sense. As long as I can successfully continue to translate between these domains, I don't see a big problem with the gaps. So, anyways, that's a question I'm working with. Is there really a problem with these gaps?
Yeah. So we need to get Pavio because he's really good on Descartes. And you know, he would always say this idea of the dualism is kind of very problematic in itself, like it's not so simple and all these other fun things. There's a larger question as well of this tendency to say something like, well, it was all Marx's fault, you know, it was Adam Smith, it was Descartes, it was this or that, and so on. And it's interesting, you know, I try as I get older not to do that because I realize more and more that I misread everything. And so my understanding of things and you know, blaming this or that, it's like, no, there are all these other factors. And I think that's good. Like what causes the modern world is a mixture of a whole lot of factors. I don't like mono theories, theories of everything, or mono explanations. Not that I'm not saying that you can't have a theory of which you use as an orienting principle for the everything you encounter, because that, in a sense, as a map is necessary. But it does become problematic when you say, well, you know, it was Descartes' fault or something like that, right? Even if, because then you always get like, I don't know, Vincent always pointed out kind of the idea of to what degree is a philosopher responsible for their misreadings. You could say that ways people understand Descartes is a misreading, but is he responsible for his misreading, right? Is he responsible for the ways that people perhaps use him to rationalize something they already have decided they want to do or something? It gets into all of those fun questions. I think of Harold Bloom here. I'll say, you know, I really like what you were saying about the qualia sensitivity. That's fascinating on qualia increasing. It is my fault. How do you know? You got me, Clayton. You know, talking about qualia salience and metaphysics. That's lovely. I do have a bias for things like Simone Weil's attention. I mean, people are talking about that and the idea, but what's very important to what you're saying, because when I talk about like, so to go back to the pluralism thing, when people ask the question, is pluralism possible? Okay, do we mean can the same nation have diversity under it? Do we mean that you can have a functioning society with a lot of different people? Like that can go in many different ways. One of the ways to think about it, you know, one of the ways I would think about it is it possible on average for people to encounter diversity, which would entail those people having their own sort of worldview, and not with time gradually either blowing up, like they can't handle their nervous system, they come to conclude it's not a good use of time, they drift away, they stop interacting, right? Like there's a way in which we could say that a way to think about the question, does pluralism work, is the question of do people on the ground begin organically organizing their life in a manner to avoid the other, right? Not because they necessarily one day, you know, wake up and say, I hate liberals or I hate conservatives. They just happen to stop going to the diner anymore. They just happen to stop, you know, speaking to their neighbor because of, and a lot of it is tied to energy use, you know, because they're trying to save energy and dealing with the other is anxiety produced, right? So in one sense, the question of can pluralism work is tied to the question of can you create a condition where the average person's energy expense is not so great when they encounter the other that they then, in a sense, rationally avoid the other for because of energy constraints, time energy constraints, right? Well, something like you're saying, like if you say, well, what you need to do is understand everyone's worldview. Well, how in the world is a given person going to understand, read up, and learn every possible worldview, right? That seems impossible. So in one sense, there's perhaps a limit to what education could accomplish to make us understand the other. And just because I understand the other does not mean I don't get overwhelmed by anxiety when I interact with them and have an emotional outburst, right? I can kind of intellectually understand other sides, but that doesn't necessarily afford personal encounter, right? And so it's to talk about some sort of activity or some sort of ground, like a girdle point, like I would associate with the lack. Like there is absolutely possibility of lack being that of which brings people together. I'd have to add to all of this. The issue is that lack is fundamentally that of which cannot be dealt with through a machinic or automatic process, right? And I think one of the reasons perhaps people are uncomfortable with lack or some sort of unknown is because that means they have to decide in it. Like they have to actively be in it. They can't know ahead of time of what to do. They can't have it be, it's not in their map of what to do. It's not, they don't have a procedure for it. They don't have a given process. They don't know the steps, right? And so that's energy expensive, right? That's difficult for people and they don't know what could occur. So what they do is instead they fall back on some sort of consistency. And like, this is the mystery of like the Dante, the partial object, the Lovecraft, like materiality being eros. Like if there's something about materialism, because it should also be noted, I think people want to avoid the lack or admitting that a fundamental premise cannot be defined, because then that leaves a mystery that would set demands on them, right? We want to just kind of go over that to know all the answers and to kind of make ourselves into machines, kind of. If indeed there's something about materiality that is always already libidinal, always already erotic, then there is something about thinking about love that has something to do with this. But love can destroy us. Love is not easy. Love demands something of us, right? It demands virtue. It demands all of these other things. And how do I love the person whose worldview I think is evil? How do I love the person whose worldview I think is completely wrong? Wouldn't that be a lie? Wouldn't that be a deceit? Wouldn't that be ignoring the truth? What does it mean to love someone who is standing for policies that I think are causing oppression or horrible things in the world, right? In fact, to love them, wouldn't that be an injustice? Because they support something terrible, right? They support Russia. They support, violence. They support ICE, you name it, right? How can you possibly love those people, right? In fact, it would be wise to be mean to them because maybe we can save all the people they're oppressing, right? And so we all get trapped in our vectors of the good. And the notion of the moral real. We have not thought how to relate the moral real with the question of love. And we have not thought the proper way to go about that. And that's one of the questions of our time, which I think when we ask, can pluralism work? It's tied into this question of love and the moral real and the proper way to organize oneself toward whom you think perhaps is a monster or supports something monstrous or supports that which is wrong. Right? How can you dwell in your own lack and girdle point to such a degree where you are able to rightly relate with that person while at the same time not necessarily saying you're wrong? Because the temptation of like the cheap perennialism is to say, oh, well, geopolitics doesn't matter. Oh, these moral differences don't matter. No, you could say the dream of like modern liberalism was to act like moral differences don't matter. No, culture wars are wars. They matter. And people they get caught up in them. And so we have to think that, but a common existential condition like you talk about in your paper, I love that phrase. I use it a lot. Aspasia, Ethan, great to see you. I'll throw it to Jockin and then Dimitri. Mr. Jockin, don't get buried in the snow, my friend.
Thank you, you too. I do hope that, unfortunately, I've joked with other friends that whenever there's a big storm, I always joke that your house somehow explodes. There's some calamity, so I'm don't worry about me. I'm more worried about you and your house, to be honest with you.
I love you, Jockin. Thank you, sir.
Yes, I hope the pipes don't burst. Or okay, I'm trying to think. I'm thinking piping.
Roof gone. Roof gone.
Or the roof gone. Collapsing roof.
Block of boxes.
Or fence. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. Car's gone. Where'd it go? I don't know.
Yeah, it's gone. Okay. So, I think the note what Dimitri's bringing up about matter. Yeah, I actually remember the lecture. Chomsky, yes.
Chomsky. Oh, yeah.
That took a minute. Yeah. So I actually remember, I saw that lecture where he talked about it. He said, we don't know what matter is. We have no idea. Which is really, and by the way, every principle, and Plato has dialogues about this. Every principle of accounts, their principles or axioms that build up, they actually don't know what they are. So actually through ignorance, you actually gain knowledge. It's actually a very hilarious example of it. Because when you push the point of the principle, the element that you use to draw out your knowledge in whatever domain, in any domain, you're not going to know it. So it actually shows an example. It's actually, again, that we actually use ignorance to have knowledge. It just gets contained. And typically what we do is we use names. That's actually a very powerful thing about names, is that it actually contains the excess of the reality. So even if we don't understand it, by naming it, we put a container on it, then we can then manipulate and use. That's actually a very important element about it. And what tends to happen, so it's either that or you have to go to another principle. You have to go to another account to explain. So for example, in physics, you got to go to metaphysics. But then you're going to run out to eventually a limit.
Don't tell the physicists this though.
I know they get pissed off. Exactly. But but Chomsky's honest. They're saying we don't know. And now a lot of them say they become pragmatic about it and go, well, what does it matter? We don't know. As long as we get the function that we want, we don't care until we get that. Which, sure, but I think was more interesting is to point out the other aspect, which is via this ignorance or not. It's even when Aristotle surprisingly has a really interesting note about this, where, for example, this kind of reduction of materialism, where there's no telos. This kind of usually gets attached with there's no telos. There's inefficient cost matter. That's all we need. One note, again, it's from Aristotle. What's really interesting was you read Dianima. He has this whole project about soul, but in particular, touch. Everyone kind of thinks that everyone's thinking about it's soul with mind, and it's kind of this running away with sight as the main area of emphasis, the sense that's mainly emphasized. Aristotle spends a huge amount of time on touch. He actually says that this is the essential. There is no body with soul without touch. Very interesting. And I think in particular, but then when you actually ask the question, well, what's going on here? What do we mean by with body, with touch, and with place? Those three aspects of it. I think actually that causes a lot of confusion. People don't understand this. He has to end up using motion to explain position. That's also very interesting. So we also notice which principles you're using to explain. Also, another example is usually talk about things that, for example, the thing that's the one, it said it's the undivided. We're using negations to explain something too. It's another mode of it. So again, another way we use names to help us understand things we don't understand. So I find, but a reason I'm bringing up this about touch is one note is Aristotle had another line about this. He says, life with touch also has desire. So it's via touch that we have desire. That's interesting. Now, there's another note. Again, this is a little more acute because technically the word for organ is also used as instrument. There is no difference in Greek. It's the same term. So, and everything that's an instrument has a telos by default. It has a purpose. It has a direction it needs to go to. Organs have that. Organs have a function that could be described. But again, that's a little cute because I know modern people don't think it that way, but I just find it interesting going through with that. But the interesting about place, I double checked the Greek for it, is so there are different kinds of ends. And there's telos, right? There's that, right? But there's also paris, end, an edge, a boundary. Doesn't have a teleological point, and that's also why people have that distinction sometimes. But what is place is the containing end that's motionless first. It's the first motionless container. That's an edge, a boundary. That's basically what place is. I just find that interesting. Because again, it's but sometimes, but actually, how's that belief to touch is kind of an interesting point. It's just notice that use of motion to explain place. That's why I'm bringing this up. So again, it's how do we deal with our when we ask for definitions, we tend to find out what actually gets the priority of things by what other terms we use to explain it, and then usually it's actually either the name itself is used in ignorance or it's used by a negational statement. So lack of motion, right, or lack of division, absence, or not division, better said. So I think that's just notes that come to my mind about this. But also, by the way, I also say this because that idea of the moral real, I think the big part is the encounter. I think I did that language when we say encounter. I think we sometimes mean that from a sight perspective. It means a touch perspective. It's a direct immediacy. I think it's because that's the thing is that a lot of times the abstractional position makes it go away. It's from far away from you. But the real reality is when it comes to indirect contact, right? So that's why you're saying so. Danny, when you're trying to say this pluralism point, this is what you're getting at. There's a difference between the Hindus another side of the world and you're hearing from an account versus your Hindus next door, and this is in your direct contact of life. This is what you're dealing with every day. So that's all I have.
No, I think it's brilliant to bring in touch here because there's also when they're in the everyday, there's a sense where you touch them, you face them. They're real. Like the difference becomes real. Whereas when it's abstract and far away, it is just information. It's not, it doesn't put a call on you. It doesn't put a demand on you. This is why there's such a comfort to basically avoid the other or to tribalize or to only be around people that think like you, right? To create some sort of enclosure because an enclosure removes a degree of touch. And I froze. But there's basically like there's something about touch when the Hindu is your neighbor, there's a sense which you face them. The difference is real to you, encounter, and thus has a demand on you, right? Because it's interesting to link touch and desire, because if you can see your neighbor and they're a Hindu and you don't want to face them, like it always demands it says something about your desire, right? Like if you're like, if you choose not to be around, you can't be in proximity of something and it not have implications for your desire, right? When the Hindu is on the other side of the world, then my relation to the Hindu, I don't have to account for my relationship to the other or the difference, right? Because it's not in my proximity. But when it's in my proximity, I have to give an account for how I relate to the Hindu or the other or the liberal or the conservative. I have to give an account for the conservative that has a view of immigration I think is xenophobic. I have to give an account for the liberal who has a view of religion that my parents would not like or something. I have to give an account for it because I interact with them and thus they are real. And that creates an existential tension that I would say basically the question of does pluralism work is the question of if the quote-unquote average person for the majority of times can handle that anxiety in a manner that does not lead to exit, right? That is the question. And that's an energy demand. And do people have the energy to do that? And then, of course, they would ask why? Why do that? Why not just kind of separate and be around people that don't have that energy demand? Why not be a quote-unquote white nationalist? Why not just kind of move to a town where everyone's conservative? Why not? Sure does seem to be less energy demanding. Well, there would need to be a very strong account with that, and at this point, it does not seem as if our world leaders are very good at giving that account. But I think also what you're saying on and I'll throw it to Dimitri and then Christian here. But I also think like the touch thing is so because there's a weird way in which is matter that which you can touch. And if it is that which you can touch, then is it that which creates desire? Because touch creates desire. And it's interesting to think that matter, touch, and desire kind of all go together in reality. And therefore, the real creates desire. Like, if it can't create desire, it doesn't matter. Ha! It's not matter and it doesn't matter. So there is an old tradition that I do think Zizek is bringing back and Lacan through that, like, of desire and existence going together. That which exists is tied to desire and how we desire and what we can touch and so on and so forth. And thus this idea that the love that moves the sun and other stars, right? And I also really like the point you were making, and this is so important, that gets to kind of the Gödel point stuff, is that if you get to the foundation, you find an ignorance. Like you find an ignorance at the foundation, right? Like your entire system is based on something you can't talk about. And thus ignorance is real knowing, because you have real knowing about the foundation that makes possible your system or your worldview or so on and so forth. Now, I would argue, I emphasize the Gödel point, is you actually have to go, you can't just say there's a Gödel point, which makes me think of what Dimitri was saying about negative. You can't just say, lack. You have to go through the work of creating your map precisely to encounter your foundational in a way that, well, is difficult, that really demands something of you. And then the ignorance is full body, not just something you say. Right? Like you have to and so in this sense, as I understand Zizek, like you need materiality precisely to encounter the repelling one, precisely to encounter the lack, not just because it always manifests, if you will, distinctly. It always manifests differently. Otherwise, you could just claim it, and thus incompleteness is a new completeness in disguise, right? Like you're actually avoiding negativity unless you have a materiality by which you encounter it. But that very encounter is also the opportunity for love and the erotic and touch and et cetera, so forth. Like you can't touch something that doesn't also, in a sense, stop you with its very materiality to be cute, right? That you actually hit a certain limit. I have, Oregon, I like what you said, but yeah, there's real knowing and ignorance, and this very ignorance that is the acceptance that all foundations are ultimately Gödel points, that they ultimately are that which you cannot define, and having real knowing of that creates the possibility of oh my gosh, it's a baby, a universal sort of experience in every singularity that does not require people to abandon their singularity. But they have to be able to handle it. They have to be able to handle it, and it's energy intensive. And then it's kind of saying, well, are you saying that people who can handle it are better than people that cannot? And you get all into all that stuff. But if we can't handle it, then the energy demands of pluralism will be too high and people will leave. And then we need to hope that handling it somehow creates energy. In the Gurdjieff, Luke, Cleo, like, is it the case, and this is kind of the shamanic tradition, Luke, I'm thinking layman and different things, is it the case that actually learning to handle this negativity actually creates energy? Because the reason why that's so important is because if it's super energy demanding and then you get on the other side and energy is gone, well, then you're done. You've run out of energy. You can't run. But if there's actually something about the ignorance of foundations, I'll say, and the ignorance found in a shared lack, as maybe Helen Rollins, like a shared sort of girdle point, if actually there is some sort of mysterious energy that is created in that space, well, then there's hope, to say something large. Because in that space actually is able to create something energetic, something that develops subjectivity, etc., so forth, that is powerful. I think there would be reason to believe that because it seems like you see that in marriages and relationships. Like if people actually say, I was wrong, and they're actually able to come together and deal with the great anxiety of having a hard conversation or the great anxiety of actually coming together and they break through, they get a quote unquote breakthrough. That's a language used in religions as well. It creates a new kind of flavor and quality of life. I think you see that. Like when you finally do that thing you were afraid to do, on the other side of it, there's actually a new energy that can arise, right? Now, this is all speculative, but there's perhaps reason to think that. My internet's bad because it's cloudy and I see the doom clouds. Forgive me, but I'm going to pass it to Dimitri and then Christian. And Dimitri, please.
All right. So yeah, first of all, I'm gonna attempt to answer Christian on Descartes. And the first thing that I want to say is that those who rant about Descartes but don't ever cite Descartes, can they please just cite Descartes? Because I never know what they mean when they say Descartes. Okay, the Cartesian split. I read Descartes. I think he's great. Like you should read him. It's not very hard to read also. Like he's not hard to read at all as a philosopher. But they don't mention him, and I don't like that. But so yeah, as I said in the chat, I think if one could postulate that there is a split in Descartes, I would say it's the split between the cogito and the res cogitans. And actually, this is where the Chomsky and Zizek disagreement starts. So, for Zizek, the moment of truth in Descartes is in his meditation about the cogito, which is self-thinking thought. And then also in that same meditation, Descartes immediately adds that, well, we could all just as much say it's doubting, self-doubting doubt. It's basically the same thing. And so this is very strange because there is apparently something that is self-causing here, and therefore we would have to call it a substance because that is the philosophical term we give to things that are self-causing. Substare, they are standing on their own. And so, but such a word like substance, and that is actually, we're talking about God here. We're talking about the uncreated. And Descartes says, no, well, it's not that res cogitans. He says it is a substance, it is self-causing, but it's a created substance. So it's a substance that has been created by the uncreated substance, and then the uncreated substance also creates res extensa, which is the impenetrability of spatiality or like extension, and the physical, one could say. But okay, so what's happening here? Well, there is the cogito in this particular meditation of Descartes, in which the cogito itself seems to be a substance. And then there's the system of Descartes, in which actually cogito is grounded in res cogitans, which is a created substance, which goes back to the uncreated substance of God. Now, what is the truth here? Well, as soon as Descartes published this, all the critics came to him and said, "You are an atheist, Descartes, because there is no self-causing cause but God. So the cogito, like you're like an individualistic atheist, right? You're like denigrating God here." And for Zizek, this is really where we can see the truth of the hysteria of Descartes, is in the violent reaction against him that tried to kind of shut him down and stop this talk about the cogito, stop grounding. And so Chomsky actually sides with res cogitans. For Zizek, the res cogitans is actually where Descartes kind of loses the novelty and I guess the philosophical innovation of the cogito is lost with res cogitans because he resubstantializes the subject. And that's where the kind of Hegelian language comes into play. So he resubstantializes the subject, whereas for Chomsky, it doesn't really matter. It's just res cogitans, and I mean, Chomsky doesn't believe in God, of course, uh, and so yeah, that's also something with modern science that no, mechanism is indeed it's fundamentally indifferent to meaning. Like the ways the particular ways that phonemes function within grammar and have their functions, like this, there's no deeper meaning to it. It's not like the word whatever, like there's something like female about feminine words in like Latin languages, or there's something masculine about masculine words in Latin languages. There can be a correlation, but it's totally arbitrary. If you dig down in the history, it becomes evident. And so, yeah, there's the. I also would like to add this to the conversation. Matter seems to be more about the question of what, like what is it? Well, it's a this, it's a chair, it's wood, it's whatever, and then um, the question of purpose is more like a why question. And so in this sense, there's already kind of an Aristotelian ordering, because if you ask, well, for what, then you're already asking why, which is then more about purpose. And so, Jockin, I just want to mention that I didn't read De Anima, but I really want to read it because Hegel says that De Anima is the best and only useful thing he ever read on the soul. So that's a very interesting thing. And yeah, like I believe for Aristotle, the soul is a kind of principle of motion, and you were explaining that with sense and these type of things. So yeah, there's in I'm learning Chinese, and something great about learning new languages is that there's weird new associations you can make. So in Chinese, the word why is 为什么, and shema is what, but then this way, adding a way before the what, it turns it into why in Chinese. So what is this way? What is the status of this way? And like with a lot of Chinese morphemes, there's lots of different meanings, but the most basic one is to do or to make, or to do an action upon something. And the character of Wei actually comes from a female monkey. So do do with that whatever you guys want. I'll end it here.
First off, that explanation of Descartes was absolutely fantastic. Thank you for going through that, very much so. And I like also what you're stressing on this sort of the separation of the mechanical and the meaning. It's just very interesting, because as you're talking about, like, we've talked about touch, like I'm now kind of going to, and I'll give it to Christian if anyone else has anything to say on this fine day. Like, is there a way that touch makes a how a why? Like when I touch a cup, does it then become a why? Because I wouldn't touch it unless I had a why, right? Like, there's a way in which, can I touch anything and not turn it into a why? Like, I'm just thinking out loud here, because even if I accidentally brush my hand against this mug here, there has to be a reason I brushed it against that mug, right? I wasn't paying attention or something, right? There has to be some sort of why. So is it touch that then kind of moves us from, that makes matter a why, a how a why? Like, and is there a way that a mechanism is removing touch? Because it's the machine doing it in the process. It's interesting to think that the mechanical removes touch, right? And like the dream of autonomous rationality or autonomous AI is that we don't have to what? touch anything. And so much of capitalism is a movement, for good or for bad, of automatic processes, not having to touch. And then that means people are, what do people say today? Nothing feels what? Real. Everything feels fake, right? Because you're not touching anything, dang it. And is the dating world so screwed up because it's online, so there's no touch? And then if you touch, it's harassment or bad or something, so there's no touch. And so, there's this complete loss. And yeah, you touch the keyboard. So I feel like the only thing real is the keyboard. The keyboard is reality, and everything else, and there are no keys that open any doors, just letters on a Word doc. But so there's something about the removal of touch. It's interesting because now it's almost like our world is one that sacrifices touch for images, like for seeing, for things we see, right? And those are all just kind of, it's interesting because you don't really often choose what you see. Like images kind of just appear in front of you. They just kind of go through the movie, et cetera, and so forth. So there's a way as well in which the loss of touch goes with a certain level of autonomy. But of course, the touching difference creates all sorts of tensions, like we're saying in pluralism. So I was thinking about that, but I will pause and throw it to Christian and then Mr. Jockin. And Christian, please. And I love the sights, Aspasia. They're fantastic in your camera. Oh, that's perfect. But Christian, please.
Those are just words. Sorry, I still have my debate with my friend lingering in my head. Also, by the way, your infant there is not yet a being. It is only existent because it hasn't yet acquired an I am concept to self-reference, and thus it is not a being, according to my friend. Yeah, probably maybe not someone who should work at a daycare, my friend, the sweetheart that she is. I'm just kidding. And thank you, Dimitri, for giving some clarity around Descartes. I haven't read Descartes, and so when I say Cartesian split, I'm just referencing what I hear other people talk about, basically, and they might not be reading Descartes correctly. And I wasn't aware that he had this kind of third principle of God unifying mind and body. And that's interesting and also resonates very much with the triadic formulation. That's exactly what you would put in the third place with mind and body, is some type of ultimate. One thing I'll throw in here, this is me continuing some speculation that I had brought up last year. I don't know if anyone remembers me talking about like consciousness being two-dimensional. It's a very strange theory, and I think it's an easier when you just think about visual field, because that seems pretty clearly two-dimensional. It's a structured two-dimensional space. But I think we'll have an intuition to say, but like my sense of touch, for instance, is not two-dimensional. But there's actually both interesting scientific and anecdotal reporting about how like consciousness, the sum of all phenomenality, can flatten into this kind of two-dimensional sense. I've certainly experienced it on certain substances that have dissociative effects on the brain. Where it does feel like everything is flattened into a two-dimensional plane. But anyways, the thing I want to introduce here is that the third category, the God, the logos, the ultimate, the abstract, if you will, the noumena, I think and this is strange, I'm sorry, but I think it might be best understood as a one-dimensional dimensionality of reality. And so like, what the fuck does that mean? And why would I say it? Well, if we understand that like kind of aspect of reality, that ability for something to be a whole, to recognize parts, or the whole of reality itself, however you want to do it, a symbol that we can somehow ground in a bigger whole context, like our phenomenal experience, whatever it might be. What is that nature of wholeness? And so like one metaphor I put forward is like, what is the nature of the circle, right? When you recognize it, there's the circle and then there's everything outside the circle. I brought this up with my chat with you, Daniel, but the boundary between the circle and everything that's not the circle is a one-dimensional boundary. It itself doesn't have its own width, right? It's you could call it a line, but when we draw a line, that's actually a shape, right? It's like a rectangle, you could say, with its own width. But then the boundary between that line that I draw and the rest of the paper, does not have width, and yet we recognize it. And so too, we can think, like, I think just very generally in terms, you can. This is stuff I'm still researching, but so it's very speculative, and I'm very uneducated about it. But from what I've read so far, there's a way to understand pure mathematics in terms of a one-dimensional framework, so to speak. Yeah, so I think that it's interesting, because then if you take that concept, then I think it makes sense of a lot of intuitions people have about the absolutes. I really love that text, sometimes attributed to what's his name, Hermes Trismegistus something. I think it's called like 26 philosophers, and it's just 26 aphorisms. Trick my gist thus, yes. And there's the one famous one in there that got repeated by Jung and a lot of other people, which is, God is a circle whose what is it? Whose center is everywhere and circumference is nowhere. Or I have it flipped around: circumference is everywhere and center is nowhere, something like that. But yeah, so it's this idea of like one dimensionality. It relates to literally everything. It's like the idea of an atom requires that one dimensionality of distinction between everything else, but then also the idea of the totality itself is a one-dimensional concept, right? And so we see here, like, at least by my lights and my kind of like logical intuitions, this understanding of like why we would want to correlate abstraction and our ability for abstract knowledge, the problem of symbol grounding, the noumenal soul, the rational soul, our ability to recognize things, to, as Plato would say, have a dosha in light of an estheton, for a phenomenological sensation to be recognized as a distinct thing, that this is going to correlate to a kind of ultimate, because we also have ultimate related to that same kind of sense. Like the idea that we know what the number one means is kind of mysterious. And so when we talk about the capital O1, I think it's that same kind of knowing that we have, what I'll call one-dimensional knowing, that correlates to all of these things. So my ability to recognize things correlates to my intuition about the holism of reality itself. And so then we have this kind of confluence between that aspect of our knowledge and our sense of the total, and thus a kind of a sense of the divine and the mystical, etc., that which cannot be known, and yet we have an intuition about. Yes, one. So that's something I'm thinking about. It's so the reason I kind of like it is because it's both like extremely mundane, right? Like the idea of a single dimension, the boundary between two things is like, and it's so like small and tiny. It's like one dimensional. It's like minuscule, and it's totalizing at the same time, which I think is really interesting. I was, well, I'll leave it there, but I'll invite Thomas to say anything if he has better understanding of this than I do about Aristotle's framework of the soul. If I have it correct, he has the three kinds of souls, which I think is the vegetative and the sensitive and the rational. Which again, another tripartite structure there, or triadic if in my lights. But then Aristotle wants to place the sensitive soul in the body, which I would say is not like a move towards, it doesn't seem like he wants to totally reduce it, and yet he wants to kind of contextualize it more fundamentally within the space of materiality, within the body, which to me it creates a little bit of vagary. But one thing I read was that he's counter to Democritus, or is it Democritus? I don't know how you say these words. Who is like a more hardcore materialist. So it's, but then I just find where he lands with that claim a bit vague. But I don't know if you have anything to enlighten me with there, Thomas.
I'll throw it to Jockin here and just say that I'm really interested in what you're saying about the single dimension, because it is very funny when I look out on these cars. Yeah, the distinction between the tire and the asphalt, it makes me think of the negative space in the FedEx sign that we talk about with lack, that actually creates the ability to apprehend something. And then you see the arrow that's there, right? And so that's very, very interesting as well. And so likewise, it's interesting to think that, everything is divided, everything is itself because of distinction, which is and is not there. And that very singularity creates a sense of unity as well, or points to a kind of unity in that same thought. That's very interesting, but I'll pause and throw it right to Jockin. Mr. Jockin, please.
Well, to not forget, so Christian's point, you're right that there are 3 modes of soul. It's actually starting there. That's where it comes from. The sensitive soul deals with the question of self-motion movement. So this is actually why the soul aspect of, as defined as self-motion, gets a little tripped up for Aristotle, because he has to explain plans. Now, Aristotle didn't know what we know, which is plans do move. They just move really, really slow. And more, but even with that omission, it still works, because plants have the sense of touch. But that's Arrow's point, is that for animals, for sensitive soul, the other organs of perception get involved, of sensation. So everything from that point up, from taste, to taste, sight, hearing, etc. Those are, and that's the thing actually big no, is that existence you can have with touch, and the soul must have that. But well-being requires the other the other natures of sensation, which is interesting. That just gives another note about why Aristotle is saying this relationship of touch with desire, and it kind of builds up his argumentation for teleology in nature from the get-go. Like, the reason why does nature develop? It's because it's trying to become more existent, and it develops the creation from and that's the thing. The idea, this is my take, my interpretation of Aristotle's notes, is that his relationship of the different kinds of souls are not totally, like, you don't get to be a logos soul without sensitive and nutritive. It's not like the logos soul is completely divorced from all the other ones. It's actually quite the opposite. It's the real, it's actually an energetic revelation building on what existed before. Meaning, even just the example from nutritional soul to sensitive soul is that exact point, is that you might have touch and digestion and all the other things of growth from your nutritional soul, but the activities of flight, running, taste, all these other things, these are realizations building up. So it reveals by building up. And then same thing goes for logos soul, but the big difference is sensitive soul has organs. So they have material organs that are attached to it for those activities. And actually a lot of what we call cognition is sensitive soul for Aristotle. So things like perception, like memory, those are sensitive soul. I say this because Aristotle admits that animals have imagination. So thus it has to have some activities of sensation. And the things we call cognition are sensitive soul relationships. But what makes things logos is, an example is reading. Reading is one of the par excellence of it, because it's a activation, it's a synchronicity of the different parts of the perceptional sensitive soul. Sight, hearing for sound, and cognition and meaning and signification meaning in the front part of your brain, for example. It's not any one part. It requires a synchronicity under a very tight time duration for reading to occur as an activity. So just as a note, in terms of like my take on Aristotle, what he's getting at, and how you're going to parse this point about like the soul with body point, is that, and it's actually a big note, is when Aristotle means the note of, oh, Christian's gone. Okay. Okay. So anyways, Christian watched the recording, I guess. This is what he says. It's not that our language today is that we're embodied. Aristotle's whole point we're sold. That's actually it's the reversal point. And that leads to now the other note, which is another a point about what, like, matter as a cause. It is a cause. Matter is an atia. It is a cause, but it's a particular kind of cause. And even though most again, I think it's fair to charge some thinkers to kind of emphasize formal final at the omission of material. That's actually an error if you do that, because there's something very important. But Aristotle has this. There's an idea called material necessity. Things must be because of its matter. And the matter is what's called its receptivity. The receptivity, aptness to take on the form. Certain forms, certain bodies need certain matter. It can't be any matter. It has to be a particular kind of matter. So for the actual example Aristotle uses in, I think it's physics. Yes, it is physics. It's the idea was he gives two kinds of necessity, material necessity and hypothetical necessity. So, and he uses a saw as an example. He uses an artifact. So it says a saw has to be a certain shape, but it also has to be a certain material. It has to be iron. It can't be rubber. It's no longer a saw if it has that. And we know that metal, a certain element of metal, is because it has certain relationships in position, right? The particular molecules of it have to be a certain density of protons and a certain arrangement and whatnot. So the point is, like, these are all forms. All matter has a form. That's what makes it intelligible for us. But it's a certain kind of form. A determination is there. And it has to be a certain kind of matter. It's similar notes about, or organs, like lungs need air to work, to do its activity, to do its work, but the heart needs blood. You can't swap one for the other, not interchangeable. So it goes to, this is what we mean by aptness and matter. That gives the cause of it, the cause of the existence of the beings, because its matter has a certain receptivity. And by the way, that language Aristotle used to talk about virtue, by the way. So I say this because there's actually a line where, it doesn't get talked a lot. Baer had a really great commentary on being and doing. It's one of my favorite texts from Aristotle in metaphysics. It's on being and doing. He spends an entire section of a chapter on what's called that-in. So when in English, what we mean, like we see something's wooden or metallic or plastic, like our language in English has a corollary in Latin and Greek where they're doing this, where it's a made of, having the nature of, or this is actually important, the character of. So a chair is wooden. This is important to connect with our point. Aristotle talked about a lot of these artifacts. The natural language we would use probably today is, where did that chair come from? It came from the wood. Like the maker made it out of the wood. But Aristotle says, no, that's actually not correct. It came out of the lack of chair. That's actually really important. What the wood did, it had the receptivity to take on that form. It was receptive to it. And it's receptive, even the language we use sometimes of like, it was chiseled. So we use that in language, we chiseled out of matter, this chair. But the very fact, anyone who works with many materials knows materiality has a certain grain to it. There's certain acting on it that it takes on well, and other that does not take on well. It breaks, it shatters, right? So that's when Aristotle is talking about the chair of receptivity to take up, shaped on by ethos. So the ethos of a person's virtue is taken on by their receptivity. The things like disposition. So when scholastics talk about dispositional quality of the person, it's that material matter aspect, aptness to take on certain qualities. This is why some people do very well in some virtues and have a hard time with others. Why are some people very lazy? Why are some people glutton? Right? Do people like to drink? They have a certain aptness, a tendency. That virtue, that basically their quality of life is made out of that, right? This is kind of talking through that. That's scholastic building off on it. There was another note. Yeah, let's see, matter, receptivity. I think I covered all my notes. Poor Daniel's frozen. He came back. Okay. What's interesting for me, right? That language for virtual they come from virtue in terms of Dumas's power, right? So it comes from that framing. But what I've been talking about virtue is this kind of aptness to take on a quality, right? Virtuality, in the way we talk about computers and the digital space, is actually the opposite. Meaning, basically, it just kind of impresses a schema, right? And arrangements put onto in a place. There's no form. Basically, virtuality gives you figures in place, but not form, not a living excessive to the virtuality. Meaning, for example, I'm seeing all you on a screen. I'm getting a schemaed image in light of you in this place, but that's not necessarily the same as seeing Daniel in person, right? Or seeing any of you in person. That's just all about that distinction. Just thinking out loud about that. That's all I got. I'll stop.
No, fantastic. And I apologize for the internet being so bad. You can tell the storm's coming, can't you? But I really appreciate the point you were making there on the idea that the chair doesn't come from the wood, it comes from the lack of the chair. It's like almost the wood comes into the lack of the chair in a certain sense. And it's very interesting as well that the human comes from not the matter, but from the lack of virtue in a certain sense. We actually, virtue is our materiality. The lack of virtue makes the human, as opposed, what's very interesting is what makes us in a certain sense is lack, then there is a possibility in that shared lack of being made. And you see, it's kind of interesting too, because if it's actually lack that makes, then really you need to be in that ignorance that the foundational affords or the girdle point or that you encounter in the other to actually be made. It's interesting as well to think that if the human is made from the lack of virtue, then don't you need to be in lack for virtue? It's kind of an interesting question. Where is virtue located, right? In that sense. And it's funny to think that it's only in lack that you can be made from the lack of virtue in the same way that you're made from the lack of wood. Because virtue is tied to this, you can't systemize it. It's live discernment, live face-to-face, live interaction, the encounter of the surprise, the encounterology. Mr. Jockin, please.
I'd like to shout out for Javier. He's on the call, but he's been working on an essay on the lack is mean as the lack, on this exact point of particularity of discernment, of mediation of the mean, geometric mean, that comes from deficiency and excess, that requires on-the-ground responsiveness of the entity in play.
Completely agree. And that dare I say, metaphysical justification would afford the possibility of pluralism working and people not giving up their worldviews or not giving up without cheapening something authoritative. Because lack has authority over you, dang it. It has it's not reducible to your preference and your taste. It is a reality well, it's interesting to think, the reality of distinction. It has reality regardless of you. And it also puts a demand on you. How will you respond? Will you be made out of virtue or not, right? And so it is interesting because that space, because the problem with pluralism is, you could say, to use psychoanalytical language, the lack of strong speech. And we've talked at Philosophy Portal about how Ferenczi and all these people, everyone's trying to restore a strong speech, authority, a big other, something that can end the debate, something that can decide what we're going to do and not just have endless deliberation that sort of goes on forever, right? Because that's the problem with pluralism. If you have to make space for everyone in every view, then everything is equal, and then it's Birdie and Donkey and everyone dies. And we talked about that, right? So there's this kind of notion of the need for something that has authority, right? Well, how do you have authority without authoritarianism, right? And who says what the authority is, right? If there is something about lack, that actually then is a space in which the subject can be made according to a lack of virtue, then the authority, in a sense, comes from the fullness of the person that is lacking. That there's a certain fullness which perhaps gets tied to I'm now thinking qualia salience, that actually this making of it, virtue and qualia salience go together, actually. And I would argue that's true. I would actually argue the virtues make you able to have qualia salience. When you have courage, you experience trees better. You experience love better. Literally, virtue and qualia salience go together. Because I tie that with conditionality. And if that is true, and actually lack is the space where virtue is developed, because it has to be surprising, then that's also the place of qualia salience. And if the act of qualia salience also affords the possibility of pluralism going together effectively without people sacrificing their difference on the altar of mediocrity, and I am unstable because of the storm, then there would be hope in that, right? So let me pause and throw it to Christian here, and I probably will have to go in a minute because this internet is not going to last, and I greatly apologize for that. But Christian, please.
Yeah, you just got me thinking about the touch as a specific form of qualia and how that can relate to virtue. And I'm just it's off the top of my head, but if we think about qualia salience, maybe as being like a therapeutic intervention, I would be skeptical that it has to do with visual perception so much, right? And frankly, like there's plenty of like meditation adepts who are, in some way or shape or form highly realized, have a sense of non-duality, and yet we still observe them, in kind of narcissistic behavior patterns, etc. But it's got me wondering, is there something maybe about the specific salience of the tactile sensation, but then there's also maybe the I forget where this comes from, but there's like the affective category of qualia, which our felt sense of our feelings basically, and I think we tend to correlate touch with feeling, right? And so then we're getting into like motivation. I feel a certain way. I feel I'm drawn to this, right? Or this makes me feel bad, or that makes me feel good, and thus I should do it, or I want to do it. So I don't want to equivocate the two, but I want to think that they're related to each other, maybe more than other sense perceptions are. And so then we might think of having higher sensory perception sensitivity as perhaps being an helpful therapeutic intervention that's just going to help increase people's virtue or resensitize people to their own feelings, basically, and so that those feelings can guide them better. Although that would need to go hand in hand with other aspects of therapy, because you can, and this happens a lot. Someone goes on a meditation retreat and all of their unprocessed trauma comes up. And we might think that's exactly because of higher qualia salience, right? Suddenly they're more in touch with their feelings that they've been kind of numbing down and deregulating, and now they're there, but they don't know what to do with them. I know that happened with me when I started meditating. I started to just feel this like oceanic rising of like emotional tension that I had no idea what to do with. So I started going to therapy, which was very, very, very helpful. I'm glad I had that intuition, because then I got to explore, where those feelings were coming from. Yeah. And also I have to apologize, Thomas. Like right when you said, and my take on Aristotle's concept of the soul, my audio cut out. And then I just see you going, I'm like, it was maddening. I'll watch the recording because I'm very interested to hear what you had to say. But I think there's one more thing I thought I was going to throw in there. We were talking about pluralism. We were talking about, something I'm referencing a lot as I'm putting forward this triadic reality flush Mysterianism whole project is Betty Edwards' book, Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, and the idea of non-symbolic perception, and also things like the Taoist concept of Wuji. This is in that paper. But when you're invoking negative space, and how I'm correlating that with the idea of boundary and one-dimensionality, blah blah blah. But I think that this is, and first of all, I think you're absolutely right. That's exactly what I mean. It's like, how do we our natural ability to discern between the positive and negative space relies on a sense of boundary, and it's not just that. It's a recognizable boundary. Like I can change the colors, I still recognize the shape. The shape itself is kind of insubstantial, right? That boundary, there's nothing to it. but I recognize the shape. And so that's kind of, well, how do we do that? Symbol grounding problem, Searle, it's Harnad, etc. But to help maybe give people an intuition for what I'm talking about, and also just I think as like a legit psychotechnology, I really recommend to people Betty Edwards' Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, because it basically just teaches you to, it builds that recognition skill. It's to recognize something as it is. And this was something I was debating with my friend about language, because I'm trying to like get her to ground her symbols. And it's just like, but they're just more words. That's why we have dictionaries. And I'm like, no. But like, what do they refer to? You have to point to something red. And we went through the Mary's Room experiment, etc. But I think we could, at the end, I was just like, please just do the practices in Betty Edwards' book, and you'll have a better sense of what I'm talking about. Because yeah, I think there's a skillfulness in that recognition that for me, it has applications beyond just being able to draw photorealistically. It teaches you something philosophical, right? And I think it's very much the concept of Wuji from Taoism, unprincipled knowing. Because when I look at pick any random object, if I'm thinking purely in reference to principled knowledge, class and category, I'm like, oh, there's an eyeball. What are eyeballs? They're like ovals, blah, 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 blah. And we don't recognize that there's no name for how that eyeball is appearing to me right now. It's its own unique, never to be repeated contour. I think that's the word that Edwards uses in her book rather than boundaries, contours. And, in order for that to not be real, in order for that to be real and thus need to have a word would mean I wouldn't even recognize it, right? I didn't say that very well. But the point is that, of course, we recognize things that we have no linguistic concept for. And in fact, in order to be able to draw photorealistically, you have to recognize this, because obviously you don't have a name for the way that Clayton's hat has a certain contour to it. No, I just recognize it. I could put a word to it and build up a habit. This would be, this is the third category versus, but of course, we know things that are pre-linguistic or alinguistic. Anyway, yeah.
I love everything you said there, and that apprehension, that book rocks. We love that at Eunoia. Bernard is all about that one. The recognition of the contour, the form, like, I'll talk about apprehension, like that ability to improve the apprehension, which then immediately you can reason about. You see the contour, say that's a hat, which conceals the pre-rational activity, the non-rational apprehension that then you immediately reason about, which thus makes it seem like it was only rationality. But there's actually this non-rational action, this apprehension that makes possible the calculation. And you could say the mistake of much thinking now is to basically say there's only calculation, when really there's this critical apprehension. And the question becomes, is there something about human, wasn't it, Clayton? Is there something about the ability to work on that apprehension that actually provides some sort of means of dealing with pluralism? Is there some sort of connection of virtue with that apprehension? Because then, virtue, qualia, salience, and metaphysics, those things kind of go together. Because the other thing I want to play on is, as I'm thinking about this idea, and I'll give it to Thomas here, Mr. Jockin, for anything, and we'll see how long the internet goes.
Can I jump in?
Please.
Yeah, one thing, because you brought up an important thing about why, and I kind of lost track of where I was going, but the philosophical implications of recognizing what I'll call like pure abstractions in their uniqueness, wuji, unprincipled knowing, is this the problem that we're talking about all the time, which is like what Dimitri was talking about earlier, which is we will just instantly put someone in a class or category. Oh, I heard you say this thing I associate with left-wingism. You're a left-winger. and then we just boom, 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 right? That's the failures of principled knowing. Not that we can dispense with it, but that's its limitation, is that it disguises what we're actually seeing. We apply this then to how we treat each other just broadly, right? And one thing, you used the term moral real, I used the term moral substance, just to kind of focus on what I call like a dimensional confusion. I see you do something, it makes me feel bad. I associate my feeling with my concept of ethics or morality. And now I'm saying, you are doing a bad thing. You do a lot of bad things. You are a bad person. And now I am no longer seeing you, right? But when you get into that unprincipled knowing, in every moment, someone is fresh, right? And even if you, of course, we shouldn't dispense with our recognition of habit, right? If I see you doing a lot of bad shit, good to assume that there's a good chance you'll do bad shit again. But that doesn't mean you are bad. And that's the problem of moral substance, is then I conflate your existence with my felt sense, which leads to my morality. And we say shit like that, right? Like, they're pure evil. Like, they are pure, like as if they're made out of evil. And that's how we think about each other. I mean, like Trump's an easy one because, they're either he's like a god or he's like, made out of evil, right? He's the orange creature. He's just like a monster. He's mythic, because we have this dimensional confusion where we think our feelings tell us something about what matter is. No, of course not. But we don't recognize this. And so I think that this is one of the motivations for me writing this book is really just like the pragmatic value. Because if we can, first of all, understand the three dimensions and properly orient our thinking within them and know, oh, well, when I say, I'm an emotivist, so I'm going to argue that when I say something's good or bad, that's a reflection of how I feel about it, not what it is in and of itself. And then we have this framework that allows us to treat each other in a more honest way, right? Not in some like loosey-goosey, compassionate way, or every moment is he might forgive himself, or I might forgive him, he might change. No. It's like, yeah, we should be practical but when we don't make that confusion, there's always at least the opportunity that, one, we could be wrong about what feelings are motivating that person. And two, that yes, salvation is always a possibility, at least. And I'll close here. Like, to me, this has really helped me understand the notion of love thine enemy, the biblical notion, and the Bhagavad Gita, and this idea that, how do we love our enemy, especially when we're in battle with them? And I think it's a difficult thing to do, which is why we don't do it. I think it probably takes a certain physiological strength, really, to manage the complexity of emotions that comes through loving someone who's also exhibiting behavior that you find absolutely repugnant, and that may even lead you to battle with them, kill them even, right? That's like a hard complex of emotions to hold in your nervous system, right? Especially if it's emotions tax the nervous system. Complex, strong emotions are going to tax it even more. So what are we going to do? We're going to just not let our emotions be complex. I'm just going to feel anger, violence, and I'm not going to love my enemy, right? Because that's hard. And then, but then we've kind of, anyways, I don't have to explain why there's so many problems, and how if we fail to love our enemies as we do battle with them, we should expect more and more and more battle and more enemies. Okay, rant over.
That was lovely. So there's a few things I'll give it to Jockin. I'm very interested, as you were saying, love your enemy, because now I'm thinking like love your enemy, and as in a sense like touch your enemy, ergo make your enemy real. And if they're real, you can't name what their fundamental principle is. Therefore, you're ignorant. Therefore, open up. Right? Like, something real is that which you can't actually name its fundamental. So there's a lack at the core, and the problem is we don't make our enemies real. So, and it's interesting to think if it's okay to battle and fight your enemy as long as in the fight you're making them real. Like it's okay to fight your enemy as long, like maybe that's the way, because we always have this problem with forgiveness and enablement, right? So it's almost like the issue is when you fight your enemy without, in a sense, touching them and making them real. Therefore, the battle can never open up a fundamental lack that opens up new possibility. What we instead do now is hate our enemy, which means we keep them abstract, which means we make them a closed system and we destroy them, right? Like love your enemy. It's interesting to think about that. And you're right with the Bhagavad Gita, with Arjuna and Krishna. It like, there's something about loving your enemy that's like, just make sure you touch your enemy, like make them real. Make sure you, and there's something about if you make your enemy real, that doesn't necessarily mean, it's just interesting because it's not like, the language is not love your enemy until they're not your enemy. There's almost some sort of idea that the loving of your enemy has some sort of, it instigates some sort of process in the act that opens up new possibility. What are those possibilities? Hard to say. Because we don't want to say there's no such thing as evil, right or wrong or whatever. That's the problem here. But there's something about the enemy as someone you really need to make real. Or else, maybe what you were saying, I'm now thinking about, it's like if you don't love your enemy, then you're always going to have enemies. The enemy, you create a closed system, there will be another one and then another one, and the battle will never end, right? But if you love your enemy, then the battle ends, actually, because you eventually hit the girdle point. You eventually get a fundamental lack that opens up. And I'm also thinking about, so that's very interesting in what you were saying. I'm also interested in this idea that, and I'll give it to Mr. Jockin, that the human is made from a lack of virtue, because I like this phrase, lack of virtue, as a play, because often virtue requires you to admit you suck. Like you have to say, I'm not honest, actually. I actually am afraid. I avoid people. Like there's always this emphasis in Lacan, and I think it's true, that you basically great to have you, Dimitri. Like you have to basically humble yourself or admit your shortcomings, right? Like to be made of the lack of virtue, you have to acknowledge your lack of virtue, is the word play I'm looking at, right? And that seems to be true. Like you actually don't develop virtue unless you go, I'm not virtuous. Like the very space in which you're made out of the lack of virtue actually is only entered by a certain acknowledgement of a lack of virtue, right? And you have to humble yourself. You can't be prideful. You have to acknowledge that you're not complete, that you need other people. So it's interesting as well on this idea that we are made from the lack of virtue, that also overlaps with a certain humility that I think has traditionally been emphasized in many traditions, right? And then it would also make sense on why humility is so important, or a certain humbling before God, because you're made from the lack of virtue. And humility is what enters into the lack of virtue, and now you can be made from virtue. So I'm playing about that. And I would also say that, like, mentioning love, like, you don't get love if you're not, like, if you're acting like you're perfect and you've got all the virtue, then your spouse is probably not too happy. Like, love doesn't go well when people act like they're all that, right? There has to be a kind of shared vulnerability, a shared openness, a shared acknowledgement of incompleteness. And that's what makes it like a fullness occur. So there's also something about the acknowledging of the lack of virtue that affords love, so that you can be made from the lack of virtue as well, right? Like relationships require a certain vulnerability. So I'm thinking about that. And then I guess what I was going to say with Dimitri as well, that I think what you were saying ties with the parallax view, because there's an idea of the parallax view being, if I hold a thumb and I close one finger and I move, the finger moves, right? Nothing moves, and yet something moves, right? So likewise, there's a way of looking at things that changes them without you doing anything, like a change of view that actually is a very big deal. Well, why would I even bother with the parallax view unless I believe the stuff you were saying on Betty Edwards with apprehension? Like, why would I even bother to do that thing, right? Also, like, and then it becomes a feedback loop that trains those things together. So, like, to kind of look at things in the way that Zizek is talking about, or Dante, if we talk about the definitive object or the partial object, why would you even bother to do that unless you believed in the possibility of an apprehension that can actually be trained by the very way you see actually transforms how things are apprehended. More can be said on that, but let me throw it to Mr. Jockin, and then if we have any final things. Mr. Jockin.
So, Christian, when you're talking about touch with feeling and emotion, I'm reminded of a note from my reading from De Anima that Aristotle says emotion is logi in matter. I think that's really interesting, especially I wish Dimitri was still on the call, because his whole comment that, oh, matter is abstract. That's the point. What's an emotion? That's exactly it. Emotion is what that means. It's an account it mattered. That's what an emotion is, which is really interesting that emotion's the term he uses for that. It's incredibly fascinating. He gives explanations about this, but another note I did want to say, basically, because the difference of like why and how discussion, I'm having one of my students read ethnography texts protocols. It's really quite interesting, though. I want to pull an example from it. I had my notes when I was talking with that student, just to clarify some notes about kind of qualia qualities actually reveal more reality sometimes than pure why answers. And that relates to, I think Aristotle's note, why is Sophia nous and episteme? Why isn't it just episteme? Episteme is the study of the science, it's the seeing of the causes. But that's not Sophia. It's nous also. And then that's why. Because nous is what gathers and sees those, as Christian's saying, those basically unaccounted for realities of absence that are actually there the whole time. And ethnography talks about this, whereas the author gives an example where, if you ask someone who's at a gas station, hey, why are you getting gas? My tank is low. Very logical. That's a very clear answer. It almost seems like dumb. It's like you get that's the answer. It seems self-explanatory. But what the ethnographer is pointing out is, but wait a minute. But why at this time are you getting gas? Where's your, why the sense of urgency? Or why the lack of urgency? Why did you wait till the emergency e-tank showed up? Why did you wait until it was 3/4 emptied? You see, that's not a justification. It doesn't explain by just, that's not the why you got gas. It's how you're getting the gas right now. What was your method of payment? Are you using your credit card? Or are you using a cash? Why? That's another, see, how are you getting gas? Explained by that. How much you're filling up? Do you stop at the initial release, or do you tap top off, for example? Which pump do you choose? See, that's interesting, right? Because under a strict formal causation, or specifically final causation especially, the discussion stops at, I just had to fulfill this need, right? But the need is qualified by other conditional materiality making up the event. The event total, not just from the final cause of fulfillment of the need, but how that need gets fulfilled. That's what ethnography is trying to draw out. And it's very artistic. Actually, the line from this ethnography text was really, really good, because it talks about, with ethnographic review, it's to recall, observe scenes and interactions like a reporter, remember dialogue and movement like an actor, see color, shape, texture, space as an artist, sense mood, rhythm, and tone as a poet. This is outstanding. All this quality is the other aspects of reality that are of the material and the kind of mode and mood of the experience of the event. It's not just simply just the causes alone. And that's what Sophia actually is, which is the complete opposite of what we think philosophy is now, which is most people think philosophy is just epistemes. If you just know the causes, schematize it, you got it. But no, it's lacking. It doesn't capture all these other qualities. And I think another note is, actually some developments on that. Obviously, we know that's not true because, quite frankly, because the fact of what's called central tendencies of populations. There's another mode of form that is not even of the individual. It's also the aggregation of populations. What I mean by that is you'll see populational trends that answer those qualia questions of how. So actually, that's the point. We've actually developed our accounts even better than that over time. So the nature of the individual is not just complete impossibility. There's also patterns that can be generated through perception, right? Through observing. Statistical analysis of looking at forms of statistics is a kind of seeing, using form, using figure, contour. It's just statistical contours instead. It's actually a different category. I just found that very interesting, just thinking about that. With a certain kind of noting of that in their tendencies, not absolutes, which is also, again, why it's a sim point about different kinds of material. You can make a chair out of wood, you can make it out of metal. It's still a chair, you see? But there's certain aptness and qualities of the chair that are different because of the materials made out of. A bench made out of metal on a hot summer day is a very different experience than one made out of wood. Trust me, tell me how I know this. Anyway, when it's directly on the sun. You see, it's not what caused that bench to be incredibly blazing hot in a 90-degree weather day, direct sunlight, was not from the fact that it was a bench. It was from the fact it was metal. Right? So I think that's just a note to pick up. I just catch my attention. And I think for the human person, their emotions is that kind of materiality, right? That it's a logos in mattered. I think it's very interesting. He talks about it that way. I think also a note, you're hinting about this hate thing. Aristotle's note about hate being an abstract category. You could be angry individuals. You cannot hate individuals. You only hate abstract types, thieves, murderers. So I think that is really interesting, because then we talk about when the liberal hates the conservative or the conservative hates the liberal, that's a category. And then when they use that language to this individual, that means they're not actually looking at this person in front of them and touching contact. They're seeing the abstractional category of ideology. That is what they're dealing with. And that's generally the problem. Daniel, your point about what's our problem in the modern world? We're just operating in maps and ideology. So we don't actually see the people in front of you. We're just operating on these maps. But actually, the demand of today is you can get away with this when this abstractional boogeyman was in another country. But now it's your neighbor. It's a very different context. And actually that gets amplified by media virtuality, showing you virtual images of types. So those people get this, like, which has been going on for a long time, right? The basically horror, like, oh my God, this boogeyman of his category is going to get me, even though I live in my suburbs and I'm totally safe and none of that would ever happen to me here. But it just shows how delicate, how fragile our processing of maps is, where virtual images of mass media communication or online social media can completely skew out our perception of reality. It just shows how much we're relying on these maps to orient ourselves in reality, because we don't trust our touch. And actually, I'll tell you what, my students, I tell this all the time, they trust their signs. They trust the symbolic ideas of how they navigate the world. They don't trust what they actually see in front of them. Most people don't actually see what's in front of them. And the way you know this, because you ask them to draw a chair, they can't draw the chair because they can't see it. They only see the idea of the chair. And we use this in the arts all the time. In fact, we know this. In fact, actually, quite frankly, a lot of time people value the ideas more than the actual form in front of you, the figure or the contour. But with an exception. But when there's a revelation, though, like that quality, when people see the work they really love and just can't describe it, they're like, oh, I just love it. I don't know why. And especially good instinct is that, again, if it's a populational trend where there's a high tendency that a certain work is people are responding to it, it's because its material arrangement is a certain mode. That's why. So I just want to bring this up. That's all I have. Great talk. I really enjoy this.
No, absolutely magnificent. Christian, please.
Yeah, I figure I'll tack on, so then you only have to, because you gotta go. Right. Yeah. Just a quick things. One thing I really liked when I was researching my paper was this quote I found, which is attributed to Pythagoras, where he likens philosophy or the philosophical framing to he says, he's speaking about philosophy, and he says, life is like the great games. Some people go there to compete, others to make money, and the best people go to observe. That kind of insight into what wisdom means to Pythagoras, if he really did say that, there's this something about observation and wisdom. Whereas, I feel like Socrates, then his, thing about wisdom was, I know that I do not know, this kind of fundamental epistemic humility, which is like, I think, you're moving into the world of theory, but then seeing how theory cannot be completed, right? Great, Mysterianist, the Tao, which can be named, is not the eternal Tao. But then we increasingly, I think, philosophy turns into theory, explanations, stories, narratives about what's going on. And then you get into competition and trying to make money, right? My theory is correct. Your theory is incorrect. This is why or buy my book, right? So I just liked kind of seeing a little bit of a lineage there in how the idea of philosophy was understood. And if I have it correctly, Pythagoras was the first to call himself a philosopher and eschewed the title of Sophos. Like, I'm not a wise man, because he was denying, don't turn me into the abstract. I am not wisdom. I just love wisdom. but yeah, I think that's, to me, this is something I would love as a message to get out to the world of philosophy lovers. It's just like just the distinction between theory and wisdom as observation and as humility, etc.
No, that was beautifully said. You know, and thank you all for being here this evening. I really like what you just said. Because there is, so for me, if I put it in a Humean there's the observation, there's the theory, of which in Socrates is the point of theory is to realize you don't know, actually. And then there's the observation on the other side of that theory, which for me would be in the Gödel point. Because what you're doing, like, what ends up happening is you need to, you know, this is because I always am playing with this idea of there's something about ideas that are very dangerous, but also necessary, but they have a tendency to create a habit to move you away from observation. So what's the right thing? And it's kind of like if you don't think ideas, you end up living through ideas without realizing it. Like you become like puppets on them. You're not free, as Jockin has pointed out. But then how do you go through ideas to get to the observation, right? And there needs to be this focus on, like Socrates is saying, the ignorance. But then you can't just say you're ignorant. Like you literally have to go through science to get to the place where you go, oh my gosh, we really don't know what matter is. Like there's the whole saying we don't know what matter is before you do science. And then the, oh my gosh, we don't know what matter is on the other side of science, right? Like there's the whole believing the map is not the territory before you make a map. And then there's the map is not the territory after you make the map. So there's a humbling there. And I associate this with the lack because you experience the lack. You don't just intellectually know the lack. You, in a sense, observe the lack. And I want to say that you have to observe the lack to get to you have to observe the lack of virtue to be made from virtue. You can't to be made from the lack of virtue. You can't just theorize the lack of virtue. You can't just theorize the lack or the Gödel point or whatever. You have to encounter it because that is what humbles you. You poured and I actually think in a psychoanalytical sense that if you don't do the work of map making, then you get libidinal problems, actually. Like, and it gets into sexual stuff and whatever. Like, you go through the work of building something that you really work hard on precisely because you need to negate it and sacrifice it. Because if you don't do that, you get various pathologies. Now, that has to be expanded on, but it actually is extremely important to do the work of constructing something precisely to address the libidinal and actually to have the right relation with desire, that if you do not do, you get problems, but you do it precisely for the negation, precisely for the encounter of the ignorance. You make a map to really get that the map is not the territory. And there's kind of a claim that I would make is that if you observe, especially now here's the other big claim I have to say, as the world becomes technologically advanced and globalized, then you really have to go through the work of the map. Now, if you in a world of givens, as we talk about in belonging, you're not encountering otherness so much, then the need to go through the work of theory can be not necessary, actually. But as you're encountering otherness, as you're being overwhelmed complexity, as you're not knowing how to organize it, the work of theory is needed to do so you're not existentially overwhelmed. But then in doing that work, we tend to get lost in it and never get back to the observation. It never comes to be in service of the encounter, right? And that's where we basically are. We're at the need of, in a sense, to the return of the observation in that way. Completely agree. And I would argue that, and I will have to go before that. I would argue to ask the question, can pluralism work intellectually, is very different from asking, can we observe pluralism? Can we observe difference? That's a different matter. Can we observe pluralistically versus think pluralistically? Well, thinking pluralistically seems problematic. But if we dwell in a Gödel point and we observe pluralistically, meaning we observe in a manner that works on qualia salience, then that's not necessarily impossible at all. And actually, if we're working together for qualia salience, those things can go together. I do want to say I'm really taken by this idea of love, like hating your enemy as an abstraction. So the command to love your enemy is to make your enemy real. And like you must make them real. You must touch them, right? And the claim is that if you love your enemy, which again, we hear that phrase, and the problem is we're thinking of love not in terms of touch, aren't we? We're thinking of love as an abstract emotion that I'm just going to abstractly love my enemy. No, like, I mean, especially back then, like if Jesus or like you touch someone you love, you hug them, right? Touch and love goes together a lot more in ancient traditions versus today where we can send an emoji, right? So I'm now kind of thinking about that. So yeah, love your enemy, touch them. and make them real as you battle them. Like, I'm also imagining Arjuna fighting the family Parjana, like you're touching them with the sword, you see their face, right? Like, that's kind of that. There's a reality. So I'm very taken by the idea of love your enemy as a making them real from an abstract category. And I guess the last thing I just want to say is make out with your enemy. That's exactly right. So, make out. Thank you, Christian. The other thing I just want to say on what Jockin was saying on the idea of the gas, because I think this is so important, is that the way I like to talk about there's a particular problem is at what point, and we talk about this in the conflict of mind, at what point is it rational to be convinced of a case? When you have 3 pieces of evidence or 4 pieces of evidence, 5 pieces of evidence, 6, at what point are you convinced? Like, if you actually pay attention to when a person is convinced of something, it's very mysterious. They're just suddenly convinced. Is it because, like, why? I would argue the moment of being convinced can never be calculated. You cannot calculate when a person is convinced of a case. And actually, this makes me think of what Jockin was saying of learning. You never know when a student learns. They just mysteriously learn, right? So likewise, like, people are convinced of something. Why? What is, like, you can't systemize it. They just suddenly, they apprehend the case and they're convinced of it, right? And it's very, very mysterious. What's very important about this is being convinced is an apprehension, not a calculation. Like, you apprehend it. And then once you're convinced, you calculate what that means. You reason what that means. Like, you never know when something is suddenly going to become rational for a person to believe. Like 10 pieces of evidence, 20, like one really powerful case, 50. Like, when does it become undeniable? And I would actually argue that the whole point of the map is indestructible is now basically it never has to be deniable. We can always defer. I'd have to get into that, and that creates a lot of problem. But there's a mysterious moment when a person apprehends they have enough gas. They apprehend that that's the right payment, right? And you can't actually calculate what that's going to be for someone. They just apprehend it, right? Well, that means that when we're convinced of something, there's a apprehension at the core when we believe that's a car. And actually, if you think of it, like, this is happening all the time. It's going to what you're saying on with the contours. That's a car. I didn't calculate to that. I just apprehended it, dang it. Like, at the core of, like, learning is observation. And this is where, for me, and I will have to go, but this is why I think it's so important, and we talk about it. When Derrida deconstructs metaphysics of the signifier, like that the word cat can never get to the phenomenon cat. So basically, he's saying, in my opinion, Derrida is saying a metaphysics based on calculation is impossible. You can never add things up to justify a metaphysical case. My critique is that Derrida overlooks that there's actually another branch of metaphysics, which I would argue is the majority, which is a metaphysics of apprehension. Like, the moment the letters CAT become cat. So it's TAC, it's TCA, CAT, oh, cat. You apprehended it, right? That is the basis of metaphysics, not cat to the phenomenon cat, which gets into the endless deferral problem. But the mysterious moment when you apprehend the word cat, or apprehend that's a car, or apprehend you're justified. That's the basis of metaphysics, and that's a metaphysics of observation. And basically, I would argue, and then I'll stop. And I know my internet's so bad today. Basically, if we're going to address pluralism and make it work, metaphysically, it has to be based on apprehension. It has to be not on signifier and presence. It has to be based on apprehension, and apprehension is lacking because you can't calculate to it. It just occurs in this mysterious way. And apprehension is conditioned by virtue and qualia salience. And the argument would be that actually greater qualia salience affords apprehension that otherwise is not possible. And I think that's why, as you're saying, qualia salience and belief in metaphysics go together. Because, like, metaphysics is, in my opinion, apprehension. It is the study of apprehension. It is the study of apprehension, which is qualia. And so the problem is we've also, in a sense, wasted. We have misunderstood metaphysics as the metaphysics of the book, as I would say it with Derrida, the signifier gap, as opposed to the metaphysics of reading, which is apprehension. And I use the word reading that I think aligns with what Jockin was saying, as reading being this combination of all the forms of knowing. And I think that's where we are, and I think the metaphysics of reading is tied to the question of pluralism and observation. But gentlemen, I've enjoyed it immensely. Thank you so much. Always good to be with you in the garage, and have a wonderful day. All the best.